ask that you stay muted, and at the end we'll have a question and answer period, and then you can unmute yourself and ask questions. This talk will also be recorded, just so everybody knows, and we'll be posting these later. So if you miss anything, or if you want to tell people about this talk, they're welcome to check it out. And we're very excited to welcome Dr. Rebecca Alvarez today. She's going to be talking about vigilante gender violence, social class, the gender bargain, and mob attacks on women worldwide. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to you, Rebecca.
Thank you so much. And if you could remind me here, do I have 15 or 20 minutes?
You can probably use the full 20 minutes.
Okay, fantastic.
Will be good.
Okay, so thank you all for coming out at the 9 o'clock in the morning to hear my talk. I really appreciate everybody being here. I think if it works for everybody, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with all y'all so you can see my slides here. I do have some images, and that's going to take me just a second. So while I'm doing that, I just like to say that everybody really at Highlands in my department and the library sort of bears, you know, some shared glory, right, in the publication of my recent book. I couldn't have done it without the library staff or without my department so kindly letting me have enough free rein time to write this book. So what I'll be talking about today is the theory behind my book, which was published by Routledge last year. So the full title is, it's kind of a mouthful. It's Vigilante Gender Violence, Social Class, the Gender Bargain, and Mob Attacks on Women Worldwide. So again, that came out just about a year ago at this point. So the genesis of this book came about because in 2012, when I was working in California and doing a lot of driving on the notorious freeway system there, I heard about this very upsetting case that probably many of you also heard about at that time. So that was almost 10 years ago at this point, almost 10 years ago today. And what happened was that a gang of men who had sort of commandeered a bus raped and manually disemboweled a woman who was riding a bus with her boyfriend at about 9 o'clock at night. And they had just gone to see the movie Life of Pi, which I like that film as well. And her story really sort of resonated with me because I felt strongly that, had I been living in New Delhi, that woman could easily have been me. And that story really affected me. I felt sort of helpless, that there wasn't much that I could do about the situation. And what you're seeing here is the sort of sense of rage and helplessness that many women in India at the time felt. So there were massive protests, there were laws that were changed in a sort of unusual twist. Actually, this is not typical, but the rapists were actually caught, and they stood trial, and actually recently several of them were hanged. But this really particularly horrific case of Jyoti Singh became sort of symbolic or emblematic of the kinds of struggles that women in India were, sort of going through as a group, right? The sort of very real danger from being in a public setting around large groups of men. And so I started to notice after, the publicity around this case that these kinds of things were happening in other countries. So this is a photograph of the funeral procession for Farkhuna, who was an Afghani Islamic scholar, one of the few female Islamic scholars in that country. And she was stoned to death by an entirely male mob in retaliation for questioning a man who was a janitor, a custodian, on religious grounds. So in other words, she was sort of exercising her authority within Afghan society as an Islamic scholar. And so in this particular case, it struck me, and there was this case really that sort of made me think, wow, that really sounds like a lynching. And I'm using that term very deliberately. So the woman in this case was beaten, she was stabbed, she was stoned, she was run over with a car. At that point, she was probably already dead. And then literally they tried to set her body on fire, and her corpse was so soaked in blood that the body wouldn't ignite. And so what you see on social media, all of this was live streamed on Facebook Live. And because the people who were doing it were proud of their actions, they felt justified in what they were doing. And you can see men actually taking their shirts off in the street in order to literally give their shirts to the fire to ignite her body, because again, it sort of wouldn't ignite on its own. So it just the degree of hatred that sort of was on display here really struck me as having echoes of the kinds of actions that happened about 100 years ago in the U.S. South, directed against the bodies of African American people who were lynched. And so that at that point, after this case occurred, I started looking for other cases, and I started finding them. And so in Nairobi, in Kenya, and in a few other African nations as well, so Zimbabwe comes to mind, there have been cases where women have been stripped, beaten, or raped by mobs of men for the offense of wearing short skirts in a public space. And so this is a photograph of women, protesting this spate of mob attacks by men. There was an entire movement that was spawned, hashtag My Dress, My Choice in Kenya. And in recent years, these attacks have somewhat abated, but there's still a risk for women in a public space in Kenya. And also, I don't have a slide of this, but I noticed that attacks were occurring against women in South Africa who were non-gender conforming or who presented themselves as butch lesbian women. And so what was happening in those cases in South Africa was a practice called corrective rape, right? Which is, I put that in air quotes. The premise behind the practice of corrective rape is that women will somehow be made straight if they're just raped by gangs of men, which is of course a ludicrous idea, but it is widely believed among some quarters in South Africa. And so I could go on to witch burnings in Papua New Guinea. There are attacks, mob attacks against women online in the United States. And so I started to study this phenomenon systemically. And so what we find is that the response from the state level has been mixed. So the government has, in the countries where this is occurring, like in India, for example, stronger laws against punishing rapists were mandated. But the implementation of stronger penalties against mob attacks and against rape doesn't necessarily correct the issue. It doesn't necessarily mean that those attacks will stop. As always, the problem is with enforcement of those rules. So the broader issue here is really deeply ingrained in the social and cultural fabric of many societies. And it's the acceptability of disregarding government, formal law, and enforcing traditional gender norms, patriarchal gender norms, through vigilante violence. And I started talking to my husband about this, who's also a sociologist. And we kind of went back and forth on this. And one night he said to me, well, there's really sort of a vigilante aspect to it, isn't there? And I just thought, bingo, that's it, vigilante gender violence. So, the term that I'm using here, vigilante gender violence, are violent acts of gender oppression, things like gang rape and or, that can lead to the death in many cases of women, like an actual lynching, that are carried out by groups or mobs or gangs of men in defiance of formal state law. And so I attribute this phenomenon to another concept that I've coined that I call the gender bargain. So patriarchy can function as a sort of, you might say almost a gentleman's bargain for non-elite men in a society. So what I mean by this is that you may be poor, you may be exploited by the elite, you may not even have a job, you may have very low life expectancy, but at least you're not female. And so that is a powerful bargain for many men who don't have high status in a society. And when the state no longer reinforces this patriarchal bargain, men may feel the need to take the law into their own hands in a sort of vigilante enforcement of patriarchal norms. And so we saw this same kind of a dynamic at play in the US South after the abolition of slavery. So we saw that there was a sort of vigilante enforcement, outside of formal state laws, gangs and mobs of whites, and typically these were non-elite whites, right? These were working class white folks in the South, not exclusively, but by and large. And so you saw these, sort of gangs, sort of with a vigilante sort of impetus, reinforcing the racial hierarchy that had been in place before. And so I would very directly compare what's happening worldwide right now around issues of gender to what happened in the United States during that post-Reconstruction period. So there's a sort of historical context to all of this, and I'll try to make this portion of my talk short, but I think it's necessary to sort of explain, where this comes from, right? And so, when we look at when we're most likely to see this type of vigilante gender violence emerge, it's during periods of history when norms about gender relations are in flux. So in other words, where the government or the state is with policies about gender, for example, supporting women's equality, where the state is ahead of where the majority of society, and particularly the majority of men in society, are up on attitudes of gender equality. And so historically, we see those norms being most likely in flux during transitional periods of sociocultural organization around what in anthropology are called modes of subsistence. And so I use this sort of framework I'm about to show you of sociocultural evolution in order to understand the gap between state policy and where sort of the general male population is. And so this is a sort of stylized graph. This used to be, probably a good 10 slides. And so I've compressed it here into one tidy graph for you to look at how gender inequality presents itself in societies with these different modes of subsistence. So 13,000 years ago, everybody on the planet was hunter-gatherer. In a hunter-gatherer society. And so in these types of societies, you actually, compared to what comes later in human history, you tend to see a relatively high degree of equality between men and women. There's typically a gendered division of labor. So in, sort of the stereotype, men hunt and women gather, although there is, in some societies, some flux between those roles. But women provide in many societies the bulk of the calories that the group consumes. So there's sort of no point in oppressing the primary food providers in your society. So gender inequality is at a fairly low ebb. And then what you see as societies tend to get bigger, larger in size, and in the case of horticulturalist societies, they get sedentary, meaning that they settle down in one place. You start to see inequality between sexes rise, in some cases quite rapidly. And then when you get to an agrarian phase of society, you have a sort of peak in gender inequality. And so, agrarian societies are where both domesticated plants and domesticated animals are at play. And this is where you get, a really big increase in population. So, you can support millions of people potentially with an agrarian mode of subsistence. Then in an industrial period, right, so think factories, right, think the Industrial Revolution beginning in England, and of course spreading to today, much of the rest of the world. What you see is a drastic decline in gender inequality as measured by things like women's ability to own property women's ability to not be property, which pretty universally in an agrarian form of society, women are property. They do not typically own property, and they have very little power within a society. And all of that changes with the rise of industry, because a woman can, sort of run a factory machine just as well as a man can. And so certainly that's not to say there's no gender inequality in industrial societies. There absolutely is. But it comes down. And of course, in a post-industrial society, such as the United States today, we see a very low level of gender inequality. And so what you see, where you see vigilante gender violence arise, is in these phases when societies are perhaps transitioning to an industrial mode of subsistence, but most of the population still has beliefs that are sort of adapted to an agrarian sort of a society. Or on the other hand, like in the case of the United States, where you see post-industrial societies or people, societies that are transitioning to a post-industrial way of life, but yet people still have a mentality that is adapted to an industrial way of life. So this sort of down curve, that's where you see the gender bargain getting challenged by the government, and you see vigilante gender violence arising in response. You don't see it on the sort of transition from hunter-gatherer to horticulturalist to pastoralist to agrarian societies, because in that case, the government itself serves the purpose of the oppressor, right? So like women by law don't have rights, so therefore men don't see as much need to try to enforce patriarchy in a vigilante kind of a sense. So there is sort of this mismatch between men's expectations about their own patriarchal dominance and what the formal policies of the state are. And so what we see is a very sort of classic victim-perpetrator profile for incidents of vigilante gender violence. So male assailants who are participants in this kind of violence are frequently raised in rural areas, or they have expectations about appropriate gender roles that are more typical of agrarian societies. So in the case of Jyoti Singh, the sort of textbook case, if you will, of this type of violence, the case that occurred about 10 years ago in New Delhi, what you saw at play there was a group of male assailants who came from farm areas, agrarian outlying village communities, who came to New Delhi, an industrializing city, in order to find work. And their victim was a woman who was sort of upwardly mobile in society. So she was going to school for a medical subspecialty that in India carries a great deal of prestige. So she was upwardly mobile, right? And so in this sort of newly industrialized type of social setting, the gender bargain is no longer honored, and workforce opportunities can elevate some women, like Jyoti Singh, above the status of some men, like her attackers. And so you can see the rage of some of these male perpetrators at the ending of the gender bargain reflected in what in criminal justice we call overkill, which is where more violence than is really needed, necessary to kill a victim is displayed. And again, that's also sort of very typical of the lynchings that you saw of African Americans 100 years ago in the United States. So can we prevent vigilante gender violence? Well, I mean, it's impossible to provide sort of a generalized prescription for preventing vigilante gender violence. But we do know that not all societies that are going through this kind of a transitory phase do evidence vigilante gender violence. So it happens in some places, but not others. In other words, where we do see it happen is in highly stratified societies, societies where the gender bargain, in other words, at least you're not a woman, may be the most appealing to men, and where losing that prestige of being male, or the relative prestige, may be most painful. And so, if there's anything that can be gleaned from my research, it's that social policies which redistribute wealth, in other words, which lessen the gap between rich and poor, can help ease the sting of the ending of the gender bargain. So examples of where that actually did happen would be Bolivia and Brazil. So Bolivia and Brazil are both nations where there was previously a very high degree of inequality. And in fact, Bolivia in particular was at one point one of the most highly stratified societies on the planet. But over the last 20 years, both of those countries actually managed to redistribute wealth and income within society. I mean, there's still plenty of inequality in both countries, but they managed to redistribute it so that the trend was toward less social stratification rather than toward more social stratification. And both Brazil and Bolivia are examples of countries that formerly had an agrarian sort of social organization and a mode of subsistence and production. And they're, both of them, are in the process of transitioning toward a more urbanized, more industrialized form of society. And in both of those countries, we haven't seen these kinds of mob attacks on women that we have seen that lead to the death of women, that we see in some of these other nations like Papua New Guinea or India or South Africa, or even the United States, if we count sort of online attacks. So I do have to cut myself off. I think I'm at exactly 20 minutes at this point, but I would love to take your questions.
Thank you so much. And yeah, now is the question period. If anybody has a question, you're welcome to unmute yourself and talk, or you're also welcome to type a question in the chat if you've got issues with your microphone, or please feel free.
Don't everybody talk at once.
I was curious, Rebecca, what has been the response to your book? Because you said it's been out for a year now.
Yeah, so the United Nations has it in their repository of books. Like, there's a selection of books from my publisher, really, that are sort of targeted toward issues that are of international interest. So there's been some interest there. I've been told by my publisher that sales have been better than the typical academic book, although I don't know that that's something to really brag about, since the average academic book sells 50 copies, so it's a low bar to clear. But yeah, I would say it's done well. Certainly, I have another book in the works at this point, and so I found that the reception for that proposal has been easier. But yeah, it's not a New York Times bestseller yet.
Could be. I actually have a question. So you mentioned online violence, especially against women in the US. Is this a trend? I don't know if you've studied this or have been looking at it. Is this also occurring worldwide in more developed countries, or is this just kind of across the board, or more in the US than elsewhere?
So this is so interesting, right? So, what does mob violence against women look like in a post-industrial society? Well, typically it doesn't look like women being stoned in the streets, right? That's a form of vigilante violence that tends to occur more in the developing world. In highly stratified post-industrial countries such as the United States, that's attacks online, and where it's really interesting to see that this kind of mob violence doesn't occur toward women or by male perpetrators in, for example, Sweden or Denmark or Norway, right? It's in societies like the United States, where there's this huge sort of potential advantage to being male, right, in a highly stratified society. And so what's really interesting to me is where this has actually taken off. So like forms of mob violence generated by, for example, incels, which that's an acronym for involuntary celibate people who are almost exclusively male and who do form these sort of online mobs to attack women. Sometimes that bleeds out and they actually attack women in real life, like Elliot Rogers in Santa Barbara in 2014. But those kinds of online mobs have actually started to become popular in India, of all places. So it's sort of this appeal, right, that we see in the same places where the actual physical violence is also appealing to men in that society. And so that's actually, I think, a good area potentially for future research. That data is a little harder to track, right? But it can be done, with the use of IP addresses and so forth. And I see you have a question in the chat, Dr. Minner?
Yeah, it looks like Dr. Minner has.
Yeah, hey, Rebecca, I actually put it in the chat, but you kind of touched upon this briefly in terms of some rural issues, but is anybody doing like tracking of where these things tend to occur? I'm particularly interested in our own nation. I mean, is it generally more common in rural areas than urban areas? Is it generally more common in poor areas than middle class or wealthy areas? Or is there really no way to kind of predict that?
Yeah, well, it's difficult to really get that accurate data, right? And so the book, actually, the last couple of the chapters of the book, besides discussing preventing vigilante of gender violence, also are sort of call for a database. And that, I think, is where the UN interest comes in, because that's what we really need, right, is a global database that looks at this specific type of violence. So we might know that, like what we call femicide, so the killing of women because they're women, we do actually have statistics on that, but we don't. I think there's a big difference between intimate partner violence, where, a husband kills a wife, for example, or a father kills a daughter, and a mob of men got in the street and killed a woman in public. There's a big difference between those types of violence, and currently we don't actually measure that. Now, you're asking about the United States in particular, Dr. Minner, and again, that looks like online mob violence, and we actually do have some, I would say, fairly inconclusive data about the typical profile of the men and boys who get online and sort of attack women online in these swarms. And they often tend to be men who are disenfranchised, who are unemployed, who, in other words, see their economic opportunities diminishing, and they see their status as males in society eroding. And some of them are really articulate and vocal about that this is exactly why they're engaging in this kind of behavior. So, they'll say things like, feminism ruined everything, women need to stay in the home. They have an entire ideology that's built up around that, and that we can measure, right? That we do have pretty good data on, because it's all over the internet, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So
what about, do you have any sense, Rebecca, like, where do we stand in the world? Is it more common here? When I think of these terrible, horrific things, I think of India, I think of some other places but do you have any sense where we as a society
the United States?
Yeah.
So, again, the violence here tends not to be physical. So we're not stringing people up in the streets, by and large. The closest we come to that is an Elliot Rodger who goes on a mass shooting spree, right? So that there is occasionally some real world violence, but it tends to be more online. It's death threats. It's threats to ruin your university server until they fire you. It's these kinds of mob attacks. And where we stand in the United States compared to other developed post-industrial nations, we're at the top of this, and that's not surprising. Really? Yes, this is not surprising, because we are the single most highly stratified, by wealth and income, developed nation. So that is, in fact, exactly what you would expect. As I said before, it's not happening in Denmark and Norway and Sweden, because there's not the incentive there for it. There's not the kinds of social inequality that we see. So if you want to talk about actual physical violence compared to the world, we're doing pretty well, as are all post-industrial countries. But when we compare the specific type of online mob violence to other developed nations, we're about the worst. Now, if we look at your original question was about general violence, so not specifically vigilante gender violence, but just like femicide, for example. Well, compared to France, The Guardian yesterday came out with an article. They do a lot of good data journalism, and the femicide rate in the United States is literally 10 times that of France, to put it in a little bit of perspective. So again, this is not the type of violence I'm studying. This is just general violence against women, femicide specifically. So yeah, and again, that is what you would expect to see with the kind of social stratification we have compared to France.
So is your basic kind of thesis, I mean, I read some of your book, not all of it still, and we've talked about this before, but is the basic idea that this is increasing, if it is increasing, or it's occurring because of the concerns that some displaced males have about particularly their economic status? Is that the driver?
Well, it's two things. So it can't be reduced to just a single explanation. What you just said has to be in place. So that's a necessary but not sufficient condition. So you do have to have that sort of change, social change in place, where the government, is saying women's rights will be protected, and men in the society are saying, nah. So that has to be in place. But also you have to have a high degree of stratification in the society. So like, for example, Bolivia and Brazil are nations where one would sort of, if that were a sufficient condition, you would expect to see violence breaking out there. But in fact, you didn't see that because they managed to, over that 20 years when women's rights were being promoted, reduce their level of stratification. If we want to go back further in history, we saw China and Russia do the same thing. Now, I'm not advocating that we should follow the trajectory of China and Russia historically, but they did a very good job of promoting women's rights. At the same time, they were decreasing to the extreme, decreasing inequality in the society. And so you didn't see those attacks against women by mobs of men. So we can kind of look at the historical case as well.
Got it. Thank you for that explanation. Very good. Thank you.
Anybody else have any questions or just anything they wanted to comment on? Well, again, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Rebecca. Very good.
Thank you.
Excellent.
Thank you all for your interest.
Thank you.
And if you want to post in the chat, I don't know if there's a place we can buy your book. Maybe you want to put that in the chat, like a link.
Sure, I'll be happy
if anybody's interested, that'd be good.